So the question that Slipcorn asked is, why do I feel so alone when I'm surrounded by people? So this is a really great question and something that a lot of people deal with, including myself, actually. I dealt with this for quite a while, where like I was around people. It wasn't like I was isolated, but I felt super, super lonely surrounded by people. And there's a couple of different sort of like options for like why this happens to people when people feel super lonely, even when they're in lots of company. I would say that the most common reason is this sort of idea of like a mask. So a lot of the time what happens is when we go through life, things start to not feel safe. You know, like being ourselves starts to not feel safe because we behave a certain way that is like true to us, and then someone makes us feel ashamed for it, or someone punishes us for it in some way. And so what happens is we start to form this sort of mask of like what society wants us to be. Okay, and we wear that mask around when we're out in the world. And what happens is when you connect with people through that mask, it doesn't actually feel like you're connecting with people, because what people are really connecting with is they're connecting with that mask. They're not connecting with you. And so it makes perfect sense that like you would feel super lonely even when you're surrounded by people, because they're not connecting with the real you. They're just connecting with this artificial version of yourself that you've made that isn't even something that you really want. It's just something that has sort of formed to protect you. So then the next question is like, okay, like that makes sense, but like how do I actually combat that mask? What do I do about it? And the answer is not easy. Like it's tough, but basically you have to start taking off that mask around people. And one of the big things that one of the big like sort of overarching like principles when you're like working on yourself that I think is really important is this idea of like training wheels. Okay, so when it comes, what I mean by training wheels is sometimes the idea of like just taking off your mask and like going out into public and like being completely yourself is like way too overwhelming. It's just like not something that feels possible. Okay, so instead what you can do is you can do it in little tiny ways, in little ways that feel a little bit safer. So one way that you could start is by taking off your mask with a single person that feels a little bit safer, that like you still would sort of like normally like wear your mask around, but like taking off the mask with just them, and like it's still gonna feel scary, but it'll feel a little bit more doable. Now, there is another option, which is that you're like, I'm not even aware that I'm wearing a mask. In which case, like, that's actually the first step. The first step is to sort of like notice, like, oh, like, I'm not actually being genuine. I'm not actually sort of like being myself. I'm sort of like putting on a show of who I think I should be. And the more that you can start to sort of notice that, the more the mask is going to sort of naturally start to crack and like deconstruct. So those are, if the answer is that you're sort of like wearing a mask and you're feeling lonely because of that, that's sort of what I would suggest overall. The other option for feeling lonely when you're around a bunch of people is more about sort of like social anxiety and fear. So this, I think I'm actually still sort of examining this for myself, like if I sort of wear a mask around people or not. But this one feels more accurate to me for like sort of what I've gone through, which is that sometimes it's not so much that you wear a mask, like you are still like your genuine person when you're out and around people, but you actually sort of don't, it's much more sort of focused around like social anxiety. Like you don't like come out of your shell, like you sort of like turtle around people. So even when you're surrounded by people, like it's actually just terrifying being surrounded by people. And so like you just sort of like turtle up and like don't come out of your shell while you're around people. And so like, yeah, it would feel super lonely because while you may be surrounded by people, you're all alone in your shell. And like that feels distinct to me versus like you're like very social and like out there, but like it's all some other projection of you rather than like your true self. Whereas like when you're just a turtle, like it's just like I don't talk much, I'm very shy, and it's really scary to sort of like reach out and connect with people. And again, the solution is not easy, but the solution is that you start reaching out in tiny little ways. Because where this sort of forms for the most part, with most people, where this sort of social anxiety forms is that you have had experiences in your life where you have reached out and been hurt because of it. You know, like you've come out of your shell and people have made you feel like crap about it. And so the trick is to start reaching out in tiny little ways. Start coming out of your shell in tiny little ways, and the more that you do that, the more comfortable you're going to get with it. Yeah, so like I think that those are sort of the main two options that come to mind when people talk about feeling lonely when they're surrounded by people. It's usually either that they're sort of wearing a mask, and so even though they're connecting with people, they're not connecting to people with their true self, they're connecting with people with the mask. And the solution is to take off the mask. And then the second option is if you're a turtler, if you have like social anxiety and you just sort of shell up whenever you're around people, the key is to start coming out of your shell in little tiny ways around people that maybe it feels a little bit safer with. And the more that you sort of change that narrative, because right now the narrative is, if I come out of my shell, I'm going to get hurt. The more that you sort of change that narrative and make it like you start to learn that, you know, if I come out of my shell, you know, some people are nice. And like it'll be okay, and I'll be okay. And this is actually something, again, sort of like a larger psychological concept. One of the things that you can start to do is one of the things that trauma does is it freezes parts of us in time. These are like also, you can also sort of think of these as like some scars, which is like an undigested ball of emotion. But no matter how you sort of think about it, the overall concept is that you have this part of you that's sort of frozen in time, and it's frozen with all of the like trauma and age and everything about the situation that happened at that time is like perfectly preserved, like a fossil. Okay. And so then whenever things come up, that part of you sort of activates and sort of like takes over and is like, I know what to do here. Because honestly, like that's what your brain is really good at. Like the example that like Dr. K uses all the time is he says like, when you go to a brand new place and you use a toilet that you've never used before, how do you know how to use that toilet? And the answer is because you've used something that looks similar in the past. And so your brain is like, okay, like we know what to do with this. It's actually the same exact thing. It's actually like so when, you know, some situation like a social situation comes up and like you feel like, oh God, like I know what happens here and I'm scared and anxious about this. It's because your brain is saying like, we know this situation. We've been here before. We're going to do this to like keep ourselves safe. And so what's really, really helpful in a lot of situations is actually sort of like having a conversation with that little part of you, because it's a younger part of you. So you sort of think about like when that first started happening to you, when you first started like feeling that social anxiety come up, what sort of like prompted that? And you sort of start to like have conversations with that little you where you say like, hey, listen, like I totally get that what happened to you back then was like not right and it was super scary and it hurt. But like things are different now, and like we can like come out of our shell and like we're gonna be okay. And when you first do it, that little part of you is gonna be like, BS, like I don't trust you as far as I can throw you. There's no way. There's no way I'm doing that. And what's really important is to go the extra step. When I hear people, because a lot of people like know, like, okay, like I need to be compassionate with myself. But what happens is like they say like, okay, like it's okay to come out. And then the other voice says like, no, I can't. And then they like give up. Then they're like, oh, well, I guess I lost. So like I'm stuck. And so like what's really important is to go that third step, is to like say like, yeah, like I totally get that. I totally get why you wouldn't want to come out, because life has taught you that it's not safe to come out. And like be that for yourself. Be the adult that your little needed when like at that time. And go that third step. And if they still don't want to come out, like that's okay. Like get in the, like there's this great meme that it's like a little comic that I love, where it's like it's this person like all curled up in a sleeping bag and they're sad. And someone comes over and is like, hey, like, are you okay? And they're like, no. And the person is like, do you want to talk about it? And they're like, no. And so then the person just comes over with their own sleeping bag and like you know, snuggles up next to them. And I think that is such a perfect representation of like what it is to like be with your little, is like when you're little, like is like, no, like there's no way I'm coming out. You say like, okay, like I totally get that. It's super scary. And like, I'm gonna sit with you through this and like support you through this. And the more that you sort of like prove to your little that like you are competent and that you know what you're doing and that you're going to keep them safe, the more sort of integrated they're going to become. The more like, the more they're going to sort of start to like settle in and be like, okay, like, you know, adult Slipcorn knows what he's doing. So I'll try, even though it feels scary, I'll trust adult Slipcorn. And let him do his thing. And then eventually, like, you just sort of stop hearing their voice at all. It stops popping up at all. So that is sort of the overall, like, I don't know, like diagnosis. And again, like, one of the things to keep in mind about these 10-minute tantras is that I'm sort of drawing on experience from like, what happens with a wide majority of people. So it's very possible that, you know, I've missed pieces of what Slipcorn is struggling with. And if, you know, like if this was helpful for you, but like you feel like there's still more to explore, that's where things like, you know, personal tantras come in, where we can actually sit down and like dive into the specifics of the things that are coming up for you. So I hope that was helpful for y'all. I see quite a few people being like, oh my God, like this is me. So that's always good. If you liked this and you're watching on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments.